The afternoon I decided to open my mouth was the same afternoon I understood that doing the right thing could cost more than I had in my pocket. It was the summer of '62, hot enough to make the hills shimmer and the tar on Main Street soften under your shoes. I was 21, working down at Whitaker Coal and Supply, a squat yard of timber sheds and cinderblock office walls that sat between the railroad spur and the river. The mountains folded around our little Appalachian town like old hands, holding everything close, our gossip, our pride, our grudges. Coal dust settled into the creases of your skin like it meant to live there. No matter how hard you scrubbed at night, there'd still be a faint gray crescent under your fingernails by morning. My mother used to shake her head at my shirts when I came in through the back door, screen slamming behind me. "You look like you've been sleeping in the stove," she'd say, but she'd have supper ready all the same, beans simmering slow, cornbread wrapped in a clean dish towel, a jar of chow-chow set between us on the table. Back then, steady work was a blessing you didn't question. My father's back had given out 2 winters earlier in a roof collapse at a different yard up the valley. He could still walk, still whittle, still listen to the Cincinnati Reds on the AM radio with the volume turned up too high, but he couldn't lift like he used to. The Reds games would drift through our open windows on summer evenings, that tinny announcer voice rising and falling with the crack of the bat while lightning bugs blinked over the yard. We weren't starving, but every dollar had a purpose before it even touched our hands. Mr. Whitaker liked to call us a family operation. He'd say it standing in the doorway of his office, white shirt sleeves rolled careful and neat, a cigar tucked in the corner of his mouth. He kept the books in thick handwritten ledgers, numbers inked in tidy columns. He had a way of clapping a man on the shoulder that felt friendly and firm at the same time. That summer we hired 6 new men, most of them recent arrivals from Italy and a couple from Mexico. They'd come through relatives up in Pittsburgh and drifted south looking for work. Their English was thin as tissue paper. They worked hard, harder than most, if I'm being honest. They lifted sacks like they were made of feathers, sweat pouring off them in the noon heat. When the whistle blew for lunch, they'd sit together in the sliver of shade behind the shed, passing around tin pails and speaking low in words I couldn't understand. I didn't think much about it at first. A man minds his business when he's young. You show up, you do your job, you keep your head down. That's what I'd been taught. That's what kept food on our table. The first flicker of doubt came on a Thursday when I was sent into the office to fetch a shipment invoice. Mr. Whitaker wasn't there. The fan on his desk turned lazy circles, stirring the smell of paper and tobacco. The ledger lay open, a page half filled with that same tidy ink. I wasn't snooping. I tell myself that even now. But my eye caught the line with my name on it. I knew my rate by heart, $1. 75 an hour. Enough to make me feel like I was inching toward something. Under the names of the new fellows, though, the number read $1. 10, some $1. 00 flat. I remember standing there with the invoice in my hand, the fan clicking like a metronome. I told myself maybe they were on probationary pay. Maybe it would go up. Maybe it wasn't my concern. But I also remembered the day before, watching Mateo. He had the widest grin you ever saw, count his pay envelope with a crease in his brow. He'd held the bills up to the light as if more might appear. He'd asked me, slow and careful, is good? Same? I'd nodded because I hadn't known otherwise. I'd nodded like a fool. That night, rain rolled in off the mountains. The air smelled of wet earth and coal smoke, and thunder shook the loose panes in our windows. I lay in bed listening to the storm and thinking about those numbers. About my father at the kitchen table, rubbing liniment into his lower back. About my mother stretching a pound of hamburger into 2 meals. About the envelope of cash that would come to me next Friday, and how I'd slide most of it across the table without a word. You don't grow up in a small town without understanding how things work. Mr. Whitaker was on the church board. He sponsored the Little League team. He paid for the striped tent that went up every August for the revival meetings, lanterns swaying in the humid dark while preachers warned us about pride and temptation. Men like him weren't questioned. Not by boys like me. The next day at lunch, I sat with the new fellows. The sun hammered down on the tin roof so hard it sounded like applause. I asked, simple as I could, how much they were getting. They told me. The numbers didn't change when spoken out loud. If anything, they felt heavier. They say is same, Mateo said, tapping his chest. Same as you. I swallowed. My tongue felt thick as the river mud. It ain't, I told him. He looked at me like I'd told him the sky was green. I explained as best I could. Drew the figures in the dust with a stick. $1.10. $1.75. The difference didn't seem like much on paper, but it was a sack of flour, a doctor's visit, a pair of boots. The men fell quiet. One of them crossed himself. Another spat into the dirt. Maybe mistake, Mateo said, hopeful. Maybe. I carried that word around for 3 days. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Mr. Whitaker would fix it if he knew. Maybe I'd misread the ledger. Maybe I should keep my mouth shut. On Sunday, I sat in church beside my parents. The sanctuary smelled of hymnals and starch. The preacher spoke about the Good Samaritan, about stopping on the side of the road when others passed by. I felt my ears burn. I kept my eyes on the back of the pew in front of me, tracing the groove where generations of hands had rested. After the service, men gathered on the steps in their short-sleeve button-downs, talking about the weather and the Reds' losing streak. Mr. Whitaker stood among them, laughing at something someone said. He saw me and lifted his chin in greeting. I thought about walking over. I thought about saying something right there in the sunlight. Instead, I drove home in my pickup, gravel rattling under the tires, and told myself I'd handle it at work. Monday morning, the air hung heavy as wet wool. I found Mr. Whitaker in his office, sleeves crisp, cigar unlit between his fingers. Sir, I said, and my voice didn't sound like it belonged to me. I was looking at the ledger the other day. The new men's pay, it ain't the same as ours. He studied me for a moment, like I was a problem he was considering how to solve. Then he leaned back in his chair. They're green, he said. They don't know the ropes yet. They do the same work. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a bright boy. You know not everybody gets the same start. The fan kept turning. Outside, someone dropped a shovel with a clang. They think they're getting the same, I said. He stood then, slow and deliberate. Walked around the desk. Put that hand on my shoulder. You keep your focus on your own envelope, he said quietly. That's how a man gets ahead. I left his office with my heart pounding in my throat. I told myself I'd tried. I told myself that was enough. But at lunch, when Mateo handed me his envelope and asked again, same? I couldn't bring myself to lie. The second time I went into that office, I didn't knock. I can't let it go, I said. The word sounded small in that cinderblock room. Mr. Whitaker's face hardened, the friendliness draining out like water from a cracked bucket. You're overstepping, he said. You want to run my books? No, sir. Then run the yard. He picked up the ledger and closed it with a soft thud. Those men agreed to the wage. They can't read the paper they signed. Silence stretched between us. I could hear the distant rumble of a train coming down the spur, metal screeching on metal. You're making trouble where there ain't any, he said finally. And trouble has a way of sticking to a man. I knew what he meant. In a town like ours, word traveled faster than the river in spring. A man labeled difficult didn't get recommended. Didn't get invited. Didn't get second chances. I thought about my father's back. About my mother's careful hands folding dollar bills into an envelope for the electric company. I thought about the steady weight of that pay in my palm each Friday. I ain't trying to make trouble, I said. He looked at me then, not as a bright boy, not as family, but as something else entirely. You keep pushing, he said, voice low and flat, and you won't have to worry about anybody's wages. Including your own. Outside, the whistle blew to call the men back to work. I stood there a moment longer, the air thick with cigar smoke that hadn't even been lit yet, and understood that whatever I did next would follow me longer than coal dust ever could. I stepped out of that office into the white glare of afternoon, the yard buzzing like nothing had shifted, like the world hadn't tilted a single degree. Men hoisted sacks. The loader groaned and clanked. Coal dust rose in lazy clouds, settling over shoulders and hair and the backs of hands. Mateo caught my eye from across the yard. He gave me that same hopeful look, like a man waiting for good news. I walked over to him slow, boots crunching on gravel. "He won't change it," I said. Mateo stared at me a long second, then nodded once. He didn't curse. Didn't shout. He just looked down at his hands, blackened at the creases, and rubbed his thumb over his palm as if he could scrub the numbers into fairness. "What we do?" he asked. That was the question, wasn't it? I didn't have a plan. I wasn't some organizer from a city up north. I was a coal yard hand with a high school diploma and a father whose back was stitched together with pain. But I knew one thing: silence had already done its damage. "You ask him," I said. "All of you. Together." They did. Not that afternoon. Not the next. It took them 2 days to gather the nerve. I watched them walk toward the office in a tight cluster, caps in hand, shirts dark with sweat. I stayed by the loading dock, heart thudding like it was trying to get out. The door shut behind them. Through the dusty window, I could see shapes moving. Mr. Whitaker's silhouette stood taller than the rest. They came out 10 minutes later, faces set in lines I hadn't seen before. "Same," Mateo said quietly. He say same. But his eyes told me the truth. By Friday, word had begun to seep through town like water through a cracked dam. It didn't take much. A cousin mentioned something at the diner. A brother-in-law raised an eyebrow at the hardware store. By Sunday, I could feel it in the way conversations softened when I walked into the room. At the diner, coffee came in thick white mugs that clunked heavy on the counter. The smell of bacon grease and strong brew hung in the air. Old men read the paper and talked about Washington like it was a foreign country. When I slid onto a stool, the waitress, who'd known me since I was knee-high, poured my coffee without meeting my eyes. "Young folks get ideas," someone muttered down the counter. I stirred my coffee and kept my gaze on the swirl of cream disappearing into brown. That afternoon, Mr. Whitaker called me into his office one last time. "You've stirred up enough," he said, not unkindly. "Business is tight. You know that. You want me to raise wages, I cut somewhere else. They're doing a full day's work. So are you." He folded his hands on the desk. "You're a good worker. I'd hate to see you throw that away over something that doesn't concern you." It concerned me. That was the trouble. "I can't pretend I didn't see it," I said. He sighed, as if I were a stubborn child refusing to understand arithmetic. "Then I can't keep you on." There wasn't any ceremony to it. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just a quiet ending in a room that smelled of paper and tobacco. When I walked out carrying my lunch pail for the last time, the yard looked smaller. The mountains seemed closer, pressing in. A couple of the older hands avoided my eyes. One gave me a brief nod that could have meant anything. Mateo stepped forward, gripping my arm. You good man," he said, voice thick. I didn't feel like one. The ride home rattled my teeth. Gravel popped against the undercarriage of the truck like distant gunfire. I rehearsed what I'd say to my parents, each version sounding thinner than the last. My mother was shelling peas at the kitchen table when I came in. The screen door slapped shut behind me, loud as a verdict. My father sat by the window, radio low, the announcer calling balls and strikes in a voice that seemed too cheerful for the weight in my chest. "You're home early," my mother said. I set the lunch pail on the counter. They let me go. The peas stopped rattling in the bowl. "For what?" my father asked, not turning from the window. I told them. Not every word, but enough. About the ledger. About the wages. About the office. My father's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the yard, on the sycamore tree bending in the late-day breeze. "Work is work," he said after a moment. "You don't spit in the hand that feeds you." I wasn't spitting. He turned then, and the look in his eyes cut deeper than any insult in town. It wasn't anger so much as fear. "We need that hand," he said quietly. My mother reached for mine across the table. Her fingers were cool, steady. "You did what you thought was right," she said. "That don't pay the light bill," my father muttered. He wasn't wrong. The weeks that followed were long and lean. I picked up odd jobs, hauling scrap, fixing fences, helping a cousin roof a barn in the blistering heat. Each time I asked about steady work, the answer came careful and polite. "We'll let you know." In a town like ours, reputation traveled faster than trains. I was the boy who made trouble. The one who couldn't keep his head down. Some folks respected it in theory. Fewer respected it in practice. At church, the preacher still shook my hand, but there was a question in his eyes now. Under the striped revival tent that August, as lanterns swayed and hymns rose into the humid dark, I listened to sermons about courage and righteousness and wondered how those words fit when your pantry shelves thinned. The immigrant fellows stayed on at the yard. They didn't have the luxury of pride. A few months later, I heard their wages had inched up, not to mine, not equal, but closer. I don't know if that was because of what happened or because business improved. I never asked. It took nearly a year before I found steady work again, this time at a smaller yard up the valley run by a man who didn't smile much but paid what he promised. We didn't talk about my past. He'd heard, I'm sure. In a way, hiring me was his own quiet statement. My father and I found our way back to each other in pieces. It happened over small things, passing the salt, fixing a hinge, listening to a ballgame without arguing about it. He never said he was proud. He never said he wasn't. But one evening, as rain tapped soft against the roof and the mountains smelled fresh and clean, he handed me his old pocket knife. "Figure you'll need this," he said. "Man's got to carve his own path." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't approval. It was something sturdier than both. I won't pretend the choice made my life easier. It didn't. Doors closed that might have opened. Promotions passed me by years later when someone remembered I'd once been difficult. Even after I married and had children of my own, there were nights I lay awake calculating how much smoother things might have been if I'd kept my mouth shut. But I also remember the feel of that ledger page under my fingertips. The way the numbers looked when I finally said them out loud. The look in Mateo's eyes when he realized someone had noticed. Courage, I learned, isn't a brass band and a headline. Most of the time it's quiet and inconvenient. It doesn't clap for itself. It doesn't put food on your table. Sometimes it empties a chair at it. Now, sitting on this old porch with the boards creaking under my weight and the evening settling soft over the hills, I can still smell coal dust if I try. I can still hear the screen door slam, the AM radio crackle, the gravel popping under my tires as I drove home to tell my parents I'd traded security for something I couldn't quite name. If you ask me whether it was worth it, I won't give you a simple answer. I lost things. Opportunities. Ease. A certain kind of belonging. But I gained a measure I carry even now, long after the dust settled and the ledgers closed. When I look back on that summer, I don't see a hero standing tall. I see a young man scared half to death, sweating through his shirt, knowing that whatever came next would be harder. And choosing it anyway.